I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today, my guest is Don Handrick, who is the resident teacher at the Thubten Norbu Ling Buddhist Center here in Santa Fe. Welcome.
Thank you, Reverend Phil. Good to be here.
So good to have you with me. And today's prophetic topic is a real simple one, setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. And this topic comes from Buddha's first sermon in the Deer Park near the holy city of Varanasi. Did I pronounce that right?
Varanasi.
Varanasi, which is usually titled with our prophetic topic, and the sermon put forth the Four Noble Truths. So we're going to look at Don, we're going to look at Buddhism, we're going to look at Tibetan Buddhism, we're going to look at the Four Noble Truths, and maybe even get into the Eightfold Path. But let's start with you, sir.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about you. How did you become a Tibetan Buddhist?
In the early 90s, I was living in San Francisco, and of course the Bay Area is very rich with a lot of alternative philosophies and spiritual paths. And I began studying Tibetan Buddhism primarily through Sogyal Rinpoche's book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which came out at the end of '92. And from there, found the organization that I work with currently, the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, FPMT, and decided to pursue more vigorous studies from 1998 through 2004, studied at the FPMT's master's program, which was a course of study done in Italy at one of our centers there, and studied with my teacher, Geshe Champa Gyatso. Finished that program, which was an investigation of the same texts that they study in the monastic tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. And then I went from there to Santa Fe and began to teach at Thubten Norbu Ling in 2005, became the resident teacher in 2006, and I'm here today because of all of that. So.
Short and concise. Let me ask you a question. You used the name Thubten Norbu Ling. Who is that?
Thubten Norbu Ling is actually a name that was given by our spiritual director, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and all of the meanings of this is a Tibetan phrase. Basically, Thubten means the teachings of the Buddha, Norbu means jewel, and Ling means land. So in essence, we're talking the land of the jewel of the Buddha's teachings. So there's often these sort of names given to our Buddhist centers in our organization by Lama Zopa, and meant to be somewhat evocative of the mission of the FPMT and its centers to produce qualified places where people can learn the teachings of the Buddha and so on. So I feel quite honored to be at a place called the land of the jewel of the Buddha's teachings, and I'm very happy to be there.
It's appropriate. It would seem to be the Western equivalent of Tibet, high up in the mountains, so to speak.
Yeah, the center that I work with in San Francisco, for example, is called Seichen Ling, which is Ling, again, land, but Seichen is great compassion. So it was a land of great compassion. So I went from the land of great compassion to the land of the jewel of the Buddha's teachings.
How nice. Let's go into this. I mean, I sometimes find it hard to believe that there might be somebody in Santa Fe who doesn't know what Buddhism is and who Buddha was, but
sure.
Why don't we just put a little bit of backstory to Buddha so people know what we're talking about and where the origins come from.
Yeah, the traditional story of the Buddha goes back around 2,600 years ago, living in India. Actually was born in sort of a corner of Nepal, but basically grew up as a young prince, Prince Siddhartha. And as a young prince, he was somewhat sheltered from the suffering of the world, and this plays a part in terms of the teachings we'll be looking at today. But his father was, quite concerned about what would happen to his son, and of course, wanting to hold on to the royal lineage, he didn't want his son to go off and disappear, so he sheltered him from all these forms of suffering. Eventually, the Buddha, as the young prince, became quite curious and managed to sneak away from the palace grounds for a while and saw a few sights that really alarmed him. The first sight being someone who was very ill, the next sight being someone who was very aged, and then the last sight, a corpse that was being paraded through the town. And having seen the reality of illness, aging, and death, he recognized that this was a reality for him and for all beings. And the fourth time he went out, he saw a mendicant wandering the streets looking for the truth, and decided that this was his path as well. So he left the palace grounds. He studied for 6 years and practiced with some ascetics, 5 ascetics, who were going very deeply into meditative concentration techniques that were taught in the Hindu tradition, still are, and still taught within the Buddhist tradition. But these meditative techniques are not an end in and of themselves, and practicing these very ascetic practices, self-mortification and so on, he found was also not a path. So having left the realm of self-indulgence and practiced the path of self-mortification, he decided to find the middle way, and it's this sort of path between the two. Having replenished his strength, the story goes that he sat down under the Bodhi tree in what's come to be known as Bodhnath now, where they have the stupa and the shrine to the Buddha's enlightenment. He sat there, and it said that over the course of an evening, he fought off all the various forces and afflictions in his own mind and achieved the state of enlightenment. Upon arising, he was somewhat in a quandary because he didn't really think that beings would have the ability and the effort and the stamina to practice what he had taught or what he had learned. So he didn't teach it yet. He basically spent about 7 weeks sort of mulling this over, and he was, the story goes that various gods from what are called the god realms in Buddhism requested him very strongly, you need to teach this, you need to teach this, please teach this. And eventually, after those 7 weeks, he decided to begin turning the wheel of Dharma, and that's the teaching that we'll be looking at today. He went to Deer Park, and the 5 ascetics were there who he had practiced with, and they were his first audience, his first disciples. And so he set in motion all of his teachings that he taught for about 45 years. We can basically say that all 45 years of those teachings were an extension of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are the real basic teachings found in all Buddhist traditions. He passed into nirvana at the age of 80. His teachings continued to disseminate throughout Asia and made their way to Tibet in the 8th century. And the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is a very rich one as well, kind of tapping into some of the Mahayana teachings that the Buddha gave.
Well, before we get that far,
Sure.
I want to back up. Let's test my knowledge in history.
Sure.
My understanding was that there was a holy man, a prophet who came to Siddhartha's father and said, your son has 2 paths. He's going to be a great leader or he's going to be a great spiritual teacher. So the father was really against the spiritual teaching and tried to keep him
on the palace grounds so he could,
exactly.
inherit the castle or the
kept him
the
captive
lineage,
and did the luxury thing and tried to, but he couldn't hold it
Seduce him
down.
with
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Also want to go into, and I don't know, my understanding was that the final breakthroughs that Buddha had was attributed to what I would attribute to be ego, but he called it Mara.
The Maras,
Yeah, and they were taunting him, and that the nirvanic meditations were 4 meditations in sequence, and that each one of them were preceded by a taunt by Mara to take him deeper.
Right.
And then at the end of, when he finally achieved this nirvanic understanding, it was also the Mara that said, now you got it, what you got to do with it?
Right.
And that was like,
Sort
that
of
was
taunting him.
that was the decision to, at that point, to basically, I'm going to go teach.
Right.
So that's a fairly accurate.
I think so. Again, what you're touching on gets into some of the differences in terms of, once again, the Hinayana, which are the more traditional, Robert Thurman calls them the individual vehicle teachings, versus the Mahayana, the universal vehicle teachings. And even the interpretation of the Buddha's life is different in these 2 perspectives. The Buddha's life, from a Hinayana perspective, he was a being just like you and I, who had been through many, many lifetimes as a bodhisattva in training and actually attained enlightenment those 2,600 years ago under the Bodhi tree. In Mahayana, this is not that it's just a story, it's more of a show. In Mahayana, they say that he actually was already a Buddha, that he was born as Prince Siddhartha, had that appearance of Prince Siddhartha while he was already a Buddha, and basically was doing this as a show to kind of demonstrate to all of us a path that we could follow and lead, and to, again, set the wheel of Dharma in motion. So some of these interpretations get to be, again, a little bit different. And when it comes down to the Fourth Noble Truth of, how do we practice that path, that gets into different interpretations too, in terms of the Hinayana and the Mahayana, though they both are driving towards the same goal, which is to release us from everything that's binding us. We can call it the four maras, we can call it, fundamental ignorance, you can call it the afflictions, you can call it a lot of different things. And in different interpretations, you're going to see different ways of relating to that. But we're all, that is the traditional story that's given within the Hinayana tradition, yeah.
And I mean, that's obviously where my exposure was. It's not a practice for me. So let me throw one more thing out at you, and just let's run it up and see what happens. My understanding was that Siddhartha was not the first person to achieve Buddha. That Buddha is a title.
Exactly.
And that there were others who had achieved it, and the difference between Siddhartha's achievement of Buddha and the others who had preceded him was that he decided to stay around and teach it. Everybody else was like so blissed out, they just kind of left their bodies and said goodbye.
Well, I don't know if I've ever heard it quite that way, but I mean, we basically would say the word Buddha means awakened one. And so anyone, and in the Mahayana tradition, we speak of everyone having Buddha nature, meaning, any sentient being, a being with consciousness, has Buddha nature, has the potential to become a Buddha. So we would say absolutely in the Mahayana that there are many beings who have achieved that state of Buddhahood prior to, Prince Siddhartha. However, the whole implication of becoming a Buddha, and again, this is the Mahayana teachings, when you become a Buddha, you're dedicated to the welfare of others. You don't do that for yourself. You achieve your own enlightenment, the fulfillment of your own purpose and your own potential, but you do it so that you can then benefit others. So the idea of a Buddha sort of becoming a Buddha and then never teaching or never being of benefit to other sentient beings would be somewhat unheard of in the Mahayana, because that's the whole goal of becoming a Buddha. And a Buddha's path as a bodhisattva is infused with wisdom and compassion and loving kindness and all sorts of qualities that they're trying to develop in order to benefit others. So yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it, but I don't know that. There might be other beings who have attained nirvana. We would kind of make a differentiation between nirvana and a Buddha's full enlightenment.
So the awakening is the teaching, the nirvana is just the step before the teaching.
Well, a nirvana is a state of liberation. Again, when we get into the Noble Truths, we can speak to that in terms of the third Noble Truth. The cessation of suffering is a state of nirvana. But a Buddha basically is a being who has attained that, but gone beyond that in a sense.
Okay.
And we would even give it a new descriptor called non-abiding nirvana, is what they speak of in the Mahayana, which means you're not sort of hanging out in your sort of solitary, peaceful world where you've abandoned all of that and you're totally liberated, but you are actually abiding in the world and taking part in the world as a compassionate force to enlighten others.
Another question here. Then I'm just checking everything I think I believe.
Sure. I'm happy to be your Wikipedia.
Thank you. We should put that on the screen. Is my definition of nirvana was the blowing out of all attachments.
Right.
Would that be a good definition?
Well, it's the extinguishment, certainly, of all of those sort of deluded and unhealthy states of mind and everything that's supported on them. Again, when we talk about the second Noble Truth, we'll get into sort of what that looks like in terms of what are those causes of our current state of suffering. But, this sort of extinguishment or blowing out, once again, there is some philosophical differences between the Hinayana and the Mahayana. If it means sort of the extinguishment of consciousness, so that there's no being after we attain nirvana, and this is a philosophy that is held to some extent in some of the more traditional Buddhist Hinayana paths, is that when you attain nirvana, you still have, of course, the body that you had in the lifetime when you attained it. When that body dies, it's over. It's like putting out a candle. Mahayana would say that that's not so. I mean, that basically your consciousness cannot be destroyed. Your fundamental consciousness has purity. all the afflictions, the attachment and so on, are removed, extinguished. But your consciousness goes on in this state of peace if you have attained just your own nirvana. If you've gone on to Buddhahood, it goes on through the actions of a Buddha, which again are involved in the world.
But not attached to the involvement?
No, not at all.
Okay.
A Buddha would be completely free, just as someone who simply attains their own nirvana is completely free from all of that.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism.
Sure.
Actually, no, I want to talk about, because and again, my own interpretation, I only speak for me. I call my ministry trans-denominational. I honor all faiths, and I try to study all faiths, and I don't always necessarily get to like the differences in the various subcategories of the faiths that I do in some instances, and some I don't. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, having spent time studying the Upanishads, for instance, I see so much of what Buddha taught rooted in them. Now, I know he comes from, it was a Hindu kingdom, it was a Hindu area that he came from. And let me back this up for a second. I mean, there are parts of Hinduism that are, which is, I've had a guest on who's made it real clear, Hinduism is not a religion, it's a philosophy. So there's parts of them, I think, that are more invested in the deity structure. And there's other parts of them which really aren't invested.
I understand.
And what I tend to see is Buddha's teachings, Buddha's philosophies are really rooted in the Upanishads that really get away from that deity structure. Am I visualizing somewhat accurately?
I think so, though it's always hard to sort of classify exactly where the various Buddhist traditions fall within that range. I mean, we can fundamentally say it is a philosophy. It is a way of, even a science of mind. It could go that far to say it's the Buddha being the first sort of cognitive therapist, kind of looking at how we think and what our thoughts are and what are they rooted in, and are there fundamental mistakes behind our thinking that can be corrected. Because everything revolves around mind in Buddhism. So in that way, it is very much grounded in what we see in Western science. At the same time, the potential then from all of this is that there can be many different manifestations of that we would, in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, sort of be recognizing as part of our fundamental potential, as well as beings who have already attained that, acting in a spiritual sphere, almost what you might call a religious sphere, to help us to attain that same state. So it doesn't become, completely isolated in terms of just my own little investigation, but it also does involve beings who are archetypes of the qualities that I'm trying to manifest. For example, the Buddha was known as a bodhisattva at the time of the Buddha, Manjushri. Manjushri is said to be a fully qualified Buddha who was appearing, again, in the Mahayana perspective, in the retinue of the Buddha. He signifies the stainless wisdom of the Buddha. You have another deity who was kind of performing the same role in terms of being Avalokiteshvara, who was also in the retinue of the Buddha. He signifies perfect compassion. And so in effect, we have like all of these beings who are enlightened beings manifesting in various ways, and they appeared in the retinue of the Buddha, and we have them as images that we use in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, that inspire us to develop the qualities in ourselves. So we can't, it's an interactive process, an interdependent process. So we aren't completely removing ourselves from the realm of what we might call deities, which in essence in Buddhism are Buddhas, other beings who have attained that state, and their interaction with us so that we can become enlightened, become just like them. So it hasn't been completely divorced in terms of the practice within Tibetan Buddhism in particular, but you'll find different approaches in different schools of Buddhism as well. So did that answer your question, or do you have additional questions?
I mean, it answers my question in that the more you talk about it, the more I'm seeing, the teachings in the Upanishad. And, what you just said, I mean, I wish I'll get you a copy of this DVD. She was in town for a month, and she was teaching over at the Vedic Chant Center. Her name was Shabraji. And one of the things we talked about was deities.
Interesting.
And she said this almost the exact same thing. It's about having a form of association for a particular quality or a particular, you know, it's almost like what Christianity did with the 500,000 different saints they created, which is an exaggeration, but it was like,
I understand.
you know, giving somebody a more specific focus and an association.
Right.
And that sounds like what, you know.
Exactly, and they're all sort of like a multifaceted jewel that we can see individual facets of, but the goal is to become the full jewel.
Yeah.
And the goal is to have all of that fully potentialized. And so it helps us to have this. I mean, and we know the role of archetypes in human history and so on, and how they are very powerful ways to release the potential that we have. So.
Okay, so let's go into Tibetan Buddhism, just a brief history of how that came about.
My understanding, again, I haven't studied Tibetan Buddhist history extensively, but my understanding is, again, the teachings came, of course, from India. For some reason, they seemed to sort of skirt past Tibet when they went to China and, you know, up into Japan and so on. But it was in around the 8th century when a couple of great teachers from India, Shantarakshita and Padmasambhava, brought the original teachings to Tibet. And there were some very favorable kings at the time who were shining brightly on Buddhism and wanting it to grow and cultivate. And so several other teachers came. The most renowned one in our tradition that we follow is a teacher who was there about 1,000 years ago named Atisha. Atisha had to go through many trials to get to Tibet, but upon arriving in Tibet was asked to provide something that would summarize the Buddha's teachings. And this is actually
the 7 points of mindfulness, is
the 7-point mind training,
yeah.
Exactly. This is one of his teachings, as well as what's come to be known as the Lam Rim. Lam Rim in Tibetan Buddhism means basically the stages of the path, the gradual path. So this is a tradition that has influenced all of the sects of Tibetan Buddhism in terms of Atisha's teachings giving a framework for how to approach the Buddha's teachings and apply them in your life. And this is what we study at our center in the Gelugpa tradition, which was the last tradition. The first tradition began with Padmasambhava, the Nyingmas, around just after the turn of the century, after the influence of Atisha and other great masters, Gampopa and so on, started the Kagyu tradition. After that was the third tradition, the Sakyas, and then the final tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, who taught in the end of the 14th century, early 15th century, and was a renowned scholar who is known for sort of putting together the teachings of Sutra and Tantra quite succinctly and elaborating on this whole stages of the path. This is the tradition that I follow and that our organization is about, the Gelugpas. And it's also the tradition that the Dalai Lamas come from. The current Dalai Lama is trained in that school of thought, though obviously is very involved in all of these 4 sects of Tibetan Buddhism.
Let's break this down a little bit.
Sure.
Could you define for the audience the terms Sutra and Tantra?
Okay. Because, yeah, this is one of the things that I think is worth going into because it does really speak to the uniqueness of Tibetan Buddhism. In my understanding, there's really only one other branch of Buddhism, one small sect in Japan that has tantric teachings. The sutra teachings are often known as just, they're the exoteric teachings, the common teachings, the teachings that the Buddha gave in various places in India to a general audience.
So sutra is a spoken word, if my translation is fairly...
Yeah, I mean, sutra we use in many different contexts. When we contrast it to Tantra, then we're simply talking about sutra referring to those open teachings that were given, again, in much more open environments versus Tantra. Tantra are the esoteric teachings of the Buddha. And it's said that actually, once again, going back to this idea of a deity, that the Buddha appeared in a different form when he taught Tantra. He appeared in the form of what's called Vajradhara, Vajradhara being kind of the essential Buddha within the Tantric path that sort of encapsulates what we are aiming for. The Tantric path is one that, again, is hard to sort of encapsulate in a very short amount of time because these are very extensive and very complex teachings. But they revolve around the fact that with this human body, we basically have the potential to transform the energy of the afflictions. Because we go back to, again, getting rid of attachment and desire being one of the key things that the Buddha is after. But the Buddha in Tantra says you can use that energy of desire, or even of anger, hatred energy, the energy without the affliction present, to completely overcome the affliction. and it's using very subtle energy in the body. It's a whole kind of inner science as to how to work with tantric teachings and tantric practices to become enlightened much more quickly. The Sutra path teaches a path to attaining Buddhahood. However, that path needs to be complemented by the tantric teachings, particularly if our compassion is such that we're motivated to become enlightened as quickly as possible. If the suffering of the world becomes unbearable to the point where we recognize that every single being will continue to suffer as long as we remain unenlightened, then we can practice the tantric path quite effectively. So it's not something for the light, faint of heart, or that person who is not wanting to put a lot of effort or energy into that path. But at the same time, these teachings it's amazing. The more I've studied Tantra, the more I'm just really quite taken by these teachings, because they are, although being again quite complex, are about sort of transforming the stuff that we're working with all the time into the path to enlightenment. And again, seeing yourself as a tantric deity, seeing yourself as fully enlightened right now, and trying to work with a transformation at a deeper level within your consciousness. So again, Tantra is maybe another another whole show.
Okay.
If we were going to go into it, I did it.
I wanted to get some definitions down for the people listening.
But it is one of the unique things about Tibetan Buddhism, and you don't find kind of the full range of tantric teachings and tantras, the teachings of the Buddha given to those more closed audiences. You don't find those in most Buddhist traditions. So.
Yet there is a tantric teaching in Hinduism.
Well, in the Tantra in Hinduism, again, my understanding from the teachings that I've had are that they weren't taught by the Buddha, so they are not tantric Buddhist teachings. Now, how much there's a relationship between tantric, practices within Hindu and within Buddhism, I can't speak to that because I haven't studied the Hindu tradition in terms of how they approach tantric practice. But it does seem that there are some pretty major differences in terms of, again, everything is done in Buddhism within a context of striving for Buddhahood, striving for this state of being a compassionate, wise, loving being that can help others to the greatest ability.
Didn't Buddha once say, if it doesn't get to the other side, it has no value?
Yeah, I mean, his whole thing was on defining what that boat is that's going to get us to the other shore. And I guess Tantra is kind of like the speedboat, they say. But for the person who's an appropriate driver of the speedboat, a speedboat's also a lot more dangerous than a rowboat. You can do a lot more harm.
Yeah.
So that's what they say about Tantra as well.
So let's get into the Four Noble Truths.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the Four Noble Truths is that, as I said, they sort of encapsulate very clearly everything that the Buddha taught. And there's this analogy that's used in the notes that we looked over ahead of time. It's very clearly laid out there. I mean, the Buddha's a skillful doctor. The Buddha's a doctor who's basically observing our situation, and in the First Noble Truth, giving us a clear idea of what it is that we're experiencing. Because at some level, we aren't really clear on this. We kind of clouded our minds to thinking that maybe everything is okay, and we need to really clearly understand what our current state is. Then the Buddha, like a good doctor, also goes on to give us sort of a diagnosis of what the causes of that illness are. Say, okay, the reason why you're in this state of bad health is because this is going on, that is going on, and so on. These are the causes behind it. Those are the first two truths that are really about kind of setting us very clearly with an understanding of where we're at and why we're in that situation. The last two truths, like any good doctor, again, if a doctor at that point said, I'm sorry that you're ill and I'm sorry that you've got all these causes of illness, but good luck with that, take care, I'm out of here, pay at the door, that we wouldn't be too impressed. But the Buddha went on to talk about an end to suffering. This is, a prognosis. This is the prognosis that we all have. This is something that we can all achieve. And again, it's within our reach, provided that we put the appropriate effort into it. And that entails the Fourth Noble Truth, the medicine, the causes that lead to our cure, lead to us eventually having that healthy state. So it's a really quite succinct and very easy to understand teaching, and it's quite amazing. This is where the Buddha's teaching started, was in this very simple kind of outline of exactly where we are and exactly where we could be. exactly why we're where we're at, and exactly how we could get to be somewhere else. I mean, I use this idea of going somewhere else, but actually nirvana, which is basically what the last two truths are about, versus samsara, which is the state of suffering that we're in currently, and which the first two truths are about, are really simply two different perspectives. And really we're talking about fundamentally changing our minds. So the state of nirvana isn't like you're going off to some other place and kind of hanging out there. It's really you have work with your mind to clarify your view so that no longer is it tainted, no longer is it a view of suffering, no longer is it a samsaric experience. You simply have a purified form of that. So once again, it's not to think that the Buddha was teaching that there's some sort of heaven that we go and abide in. No, there's simply a state of peace that we attain through calming all these factors in our mind.
They were familiar with Emanuel Swedenborg.
Mm-hmm.
He defined heaven and hell as a place of limitations, and heaven as a place without limitations.
Yeah.
If we're not attached, that's heaven. I mean, that's the way I see it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not about going someplace, but it's about bringing, heaven comes from within, not from without. And that's what the teaching is.
Exactly.
So let's break this out a little bit. So the first noble truth is clinical observation, which was all conditioned existence is suffering. Mm-hmm. So to me, what really pops out here is that word conditioned.
Exactly.
So it's not just existence. How do we define conditioned existence as opposed to existence?
It's hard to talk about that without getting into the second noble truth, because the second noble truth are really the conditions.
Okay,
but let's go ahead and do that.
Let me give them the second noble truth, and we'll put them together. So the first one is the clinical observation. The second one is the diagnosis. The cause of suffering are karma and the afflictions, especially ignorance.
Okay. So what we mean by conditioned existence then is we're talking about existence that arises through the force of three factors, again, that you've just mentioned. The first one that's most closely tied to our experience of suffering is karma. And we're talking here about that karma that is produced through afflicted states of mind, which have as their root ignorance. So let's go in and define each of these and look at them a little bit more clearly. Karma, again, is a very basic principle that is taught in many Eastern traditions, and we have an understanding of it in the West that perhaps isn't always quite accurate. But karma is basically referring to this fundamental law of cause and effect, and how everything that we do with our minds plants a seed that ripens into an experience. The Buddha sort of took the teachings of karma and put them within the context of the larger law of cause and effect that we see in the world. We understand cause and effect very clearly when it comes to the physical world. We wouldn't plant an apple seed and expect that an avocado tree was going to grow. It simply doesn't happen. If the apple seed goes in the ground and it gets all the proper conditions, an apple tree arises, and eventually we get apples. So we're quite clear that cause and effect works in the physical world. What the Buddha is saying with karma is that our experiences, what we have happen to us, what states of mind we have, and so on, are all influenced by causes. We identify what those causes are, we can put an end to experiencing that karma. Karma, again, is rooted, as I said, in the afflicted states of mind, particularly the karma that gives rise to the more manifest forms of suffering that we experience. But basically, everything we experience in samsara, in our conditioned world, is a form of suffering.
Is karma multi-existence?
Sure, absolutely.
So we carry karma from a previous life. We believe in reincarnation. And what I did this life, I bring with me. Then I still have cause and effect.
Exactly.
So I'm dealing with what I bring with me, and my hope is to not only deal with that, but not create new as I go along.
Exactly. Pema Chodron has a wonderful quote that I use a lot that says, karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn.
Exactly.
So in a sense, everything that we experience becomes a lesson if we look at it that way. Instead, what happens is it usually becomes a way for us to reinforce the behaviors that got us in trouble in the first place. And that's through, when someone gets really mad at you, upset at you, and does something to harm you, you usually harm back. And when you harm back, you simply create the causes to be harmed again in the future.
Exactly.
And so, karma is based on this idea of mind having continuity. What we call mind in Buddhism is a fundamental aspect of all of our experiences. It's consciousness that is about knowing. It's not material. It's not the brain, though it's very much tied, interdependent with the brain in this condition, in this human life that we have.
So other people can call it spirit or soul, and we're still
Exactly.
talking the same thing.
It's getting imprints from prior lives and bringing those forward, and they're ripening into experiences, and then based on how you react to those experiences, creating new imprints that carry you forward into future experiences. So it all is, interconnected. And again, the forces that give rise to karma, I pointed out afflictions. Of course, afflictions are those states of mind that do disturb the mind and that are not sort of based in an accurate view of reality. Things like desirous attachment and jealousy, hatred, anger, all of these things are, we can see if we really look at them that they're not healthy states of mind. But basically, they give rise usually to experiences that, as I was saying, are kind of a grosser form of suffering. Even when we have a more compassionate mind, as long as we're conditioned by the deeper cause, which is that third one, which is ignorance, we're going to still create causes for only samsaric experiences that are still going to be somewhat unsatisfactory.
And what would you say the ignorance of that's causing this?
So the ignorance that's driving the whole show. We can understand from the Buddha's teachings that there's many different mistaken conceptions that we have. And maybe I'll just touch on one or two of those first, and then we'll talk briefly about what this fundamental ignorance is. I mean, one of the things that speaks to even this first noble truth, when we talk about the truth of suffering, the Buddha says even our experiences of pleasure, our dukkha is the word he used in the original Pali and Sanskrit. It's a very similar word in both of those. He basically said that even what we experience that we call happiness is unsatisfactory. Why? Because in its nature, it's not fundamentally happiness. The happiest experience you can imagine, first of all, is incapable of being sustained, incapable of lasting. It's transitory. It's
so the most that would last is one lifetime.
Well, and even within a single lifetime, an individual experience of happiness, even the most blissful experience, which most humans would call the bliss of orgasm, which could be the bliss of eating really delicious food or the bliss of watching a beautiful sunset, but whatever level of bliss that you experience is incapable of providing lasting peace, lasting happiness. And if we partake of it too long, oftentimes we find that these things actually lead to pain. They lead to suffering. So we have a misconception there. That is a form of ignorance that is basically misconceiving what we're going after in this life as pleasure, which craving and attachment often is involved in. We're constantly seeking that, and it's incapable of satisfying us. It's like salt water for quenching thirst. It simply can't do it.
So what we're really chasing is something external, and external cannot be a part of us, therefore it cannot sustain us.
In some way, yes. I mean, the external world does exist and is a factor in our experience, but we even see different experiences of the external world.
Yeah.
Some people are quite delighted by a Mozart symphony, and some people are delighted by, hip hop. Well,
But if I attach to either one
exactly.
of them, I'm creating
You're
the
creating
suffering.
problems.
Yes.
And when it comes down to it, so I was talking about this being one level of ignorance. We can look at different other misconceptions, but let's go to that fundamental ignorance that's behind it. What the Buddha says, and he taught in many different ways, kind of talking about this idea of selflessness. The Buddha says that we're misconceiving a self to exist in a way that is actually contrary to how the self exists. In the traditional Hindu teachings, there's this idea of Atman, and the Atman being a sense of a soul or self that is sort of who you are in your essence, that eventually the goal is to, as I understand it, again, I haven't studied Hinduism, maybe you could speak to it better than I could, but the idea, if you're studying it with regard to, I don't know what the Vedic tradition, what is the idea is to unite with the mind of Brahma or of Vishnu or whatever the case might be. And your sort of Atman and that are in essence the same thing, but right now we've separated ourselves from that.
And we need to see no separation.
Exactly.
And that's the root of all the ignorance, is the seeing a separation.
Yeah. So now Buddha, in his time, he said that basically he had a philosophy of anatman, that there is no self, that there is no idea of that. It's just an idea, it's just a concept, but there is nothing that really is the self. And when it comes down to it, if we go to the deepest teachings that the Buddha gave, we can extend that to that extreme of saying that basically, if we examine, we find that a self is really just a dependent arising. The Buddha uses this word a lot. The Buddha is all about things being independence and causes and conditions. And he basically says that the self that we know of and that we adhere to so strongly is a misconception of what is really just a dependent arising. It's just something coming into existence because, as Lama Zopa Rinpoche, my teacher, says, he says basically, if the only reason why we can say I am sitting on this chair is because my body and my mind are on this chair. There is no self that is sitting on this chair in the way that we think of a real self. Instead, self is a label that we put on the basis of this mind and body. But even body is a label we put on the basis of all these parts of the body. And mind is a label we put on the basis of all these various moments of mind, types of mind. And then again, we can go to parts of the body. An arm is only a label being put on the basis of what we call a hand and a forearm and an upper arm and so on. You know, everything is in the end, we can't find anything that exists really concretely and independently. So the fundamental ignorance that's driving the show is particularly when we think about the self, the I, and this big capital I that we revolve around and that we think we need to satisfy through our craving for these objects of pleasure and having aversion towards the objects that we don't like in our lives. And we spend our whole lives trying to get this all right with a false view of who we are from the beginning.
That these things even matter.
Exactly. That it's possible. I mean, instead, we don't recognize that it's impossible, that it is absolutely impossible because no such self exists. A self does exist, but a self exists, again to quote Lama Zopa Rinpoche, almost as if it doesn't.
A self exists to teach us the folly of self.
I mean, because there is a self that we can say the self attains nirvana, the self attains Buddhahood, but all of those too are merely conditioned. They're merely arising through, not conditioned in the same way that we spoke of conditioned existence, but they are conditioned by their own causes and arising through that. Things don't have any real independent, concrete, self-instituting, self-supporting identity. And things are simply transitory phenomena arising in the sphere of all of this, and we're, in a sense, structuring our world and then mistakenly holding the world to be structured in the way that we've structured it. This is a way I've kind of gotten a handle on it myself. This isn't a traditional teaching, but it's like we organize the world. You know, we call this a cup, and we call that a watch, and we call, you know, eyeglasses and person and all of this. And then we think that they are that from their own side. But they really are just designations. They really are just labels being given. And there is nothing that we can find that is concretely, independently those things. Rather, they're just arising on the basis of all these various causes and conditions, on the basis of their parts. And in the end, on the basis of, you know, me calling it a cup, you calling it a cup. We all sort of conventionally agree to call it a cup. But what cup is really there? And this is the same with the self. And we basically call this an I. And then we reify this I. We put it in a position where we think that there is some concrete I that needs to be satisfied through all of these various things. But it's actually incapable of satisfying that because it doesn't even exist. It's a mistaken conception.
So what would basically...
Pretty profound teaching. It's a difficult
Yes.
teaching to get to. These are the teachings, the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom teachings that the Buddha gave a little bit later in his career. But
And what we've basically been talking about is the third and the fourth noble truth.
touching on those exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
so-
you know, this is what we're really driving for, is to realize this wisdom. Because we find that, you know, in our minds even, we have antithetical states of mind. If you have love for someone, you can't have hatred. If you have compassion for someone, you can't sort of have a disregard for their state of suffering. The same thing, if we have wisdom in our minds, we can't have ignorance. So if we build this ignorance through first understanding it conceptually, and again that entails teaching after teaching on these teachings on selflessness and how self doesn't exist and how it actually is existing quite nominally, just through the force of imputation. If we get teachings on that, we begin to understand it conceptually. If we unite that with very deep meditative concentration, it's said that we can actually have a deeper realization of that and cut through that ignorance. And that wisdom is diametrically opposed to ignorance.
So the meditation becomes the place where we touch the source.
Absolutely. That's why when we get to the fourth noble truth, which is the path, we say, oftentimes in Tibetan Buddhism, we talk about the path in terms of three main trainings. The first is your fundamental foundation of morality. You really have to have good control over, first, all this external way that you're manifesting in the world, because that affects you. That's your karma that you're creating that kind of has a deeper effect on your experience. The second thing that we have to do is, having curtailed behavior that isn't so conducive to a calm mind, is to then calm the mind further through concentration. And these are, again, the same techniques that the Buddha learned from the Hindu tradition that are utilized in the Buddhist tradition as well, developing what we call single-pointed focus, concentrated mind that can delve very deeply. We unite that then with the third training in wisdom, which is to take it to a deeper level of understanding through analyzing how things exist, how the self exists, how everything exists. And in this way, through these three higher trainings, you can accomplish the goal of nirvana, the cessation of suffering. But we can go back and touch on some of these others as well to flesh them out.
I think what I'd like to do first for the audience is just take the Four Noble Truths right now, all four in sequence. And then we can go right into the Noble Eightfold Path, and we're going to have a minimal amount of time to touch on that, but that's okay. So the first Noble Truth is clinical observation. All conditioned existence is suffering. Second Noble Truth, diagnosis. The causes of suffering are karma, and the afflictions, especially ignorance. The third Noble Truth is prognosis. Release from suffering comes through eradicating ignorance and the afflictions based upon it. And the fourth is the cure. The way to achieve that release is the Noble Eightfold Path. So we got 8. We've got 5 minutes. How do you want to break them down?
5 minutes, okay.
Well, we got a little more than that, but what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of time to give some contact information
Sure.
and then a parting thought later on.
Now, when we look at these 8, for example, let's go back to what I was just speaking of. The training in morality, we could say that 3 of these, of the eightfold, the Noble Eightfold Path, are pertaining to our morality. Right speech, right action, right livelihood. What are we doing with our speech to avoid unhealthy ways of speaking? Lying, deceptive speech, divisive talk, harsh speech, and so on. What are we doing with our actions to avoid killing, harming others physically, stealing from them, and so on? And what are we doing with our livelihood? That speaks to, how do we go about being in the world and being a part of the world so that we aren't engaged in overt harm to others and are actually, hopefully, in occupations that are supportive of what we're trying to do on our path. So that's the very first one. The second one, when it comes to concentration, are actually the last 3 of the Eightfold Path. And that would be, having right effort in terms of putting effort into being very clear about what one needs to do and what one needs to abandon. Right mindfulness, being aware of what one is doing at all times and using that particularly in one's meditation to be quite aware of the nature of our minds and the clouds of delusions and afflictions that are arising. And then right concentration itself, which is basically developing that fundamentally stable and focused mind that we can then sort of use that as a platform for deeper realizations. So through right effort, mindfulness, and concentration, we're able to accomplish that second training. When it comes to the last training, the training in wisdom, we're basically talking about, in the Eightfold Path, we're talking about right thought and right understanding. So right understanding means really being quite clear, particularly about the wisdom teachings that the Buddha gave, how we need to practice this path and understand what the Buddha is teaching, because that's the fundamental cure, that's the fundamental thing we need to take to remove ignorance. Also, right thought, right intention, doing this with the proper intention, the proper focus, so that we abandon, again, the mistaken ideas and the wrong conceptions and put our energy into actually accomplishing the correct realizations. So we could encapsulate, again, all 8 of those in this tradition, and we're looking at, just the 3 higher trainings. In essence, they're all there. We have additional trainings that In the Mahayana tradition, they would focus on, the bodhisattva trainings, the trainings that would enhance our connection with others through practicing generosity and practicing patience and practicing, other aspects of the bodhisattva path that will help to connect with others compassionately.
Let me ask you a question. If I were to boil down the essence of what Buddha was teaching, wouldn't I not just get to right meditation? If I focused in on meditation, wouldn't the others fall into place?
Well, the problem is, there's a saying that my teacher in Italy, Geshe Japa Gyatso, quoted right at the beginning of our studies, the 7 years of studies. He said, it's one of the Kadampa lamas that came from the tradition of Atisha, said that meditation without proper learning is really like climbing a rock face with your fist closed. And so meditation is kind of, it's a skill. It's not an end in and of itself. It's, once again, the boat. It's sort of what gets you to a deeper understanding of things is having a stable mind. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we talk about basically two types of meditation. One is this very deep concentration that's quite focused. The other one is our analytical meditation, which is what wisdom is about. If you have this flickering all the time, there's no way that the light is going to be steady enough to see things properly. So you need that flame very steady, very calm. Then you can use it as a platform to see how things exist. So in a sense, what we're talking about is meditation as a tool. And absolutely, the Buddha's teachings are based in cultivating meditative qualities, but then using that as a platform to understanding what the Buddha is teaching and to apply it to one's life and to understand it in one's own mind.
Okay. That's probably the quickest you've ever gone through the Noble Eightfold Path.
I was telling students at the center, because we just went through 5 Sundays on the Four Noble Truths, and barely got them in that amount of time. But I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk a bit about them. And
That's a world speed record. We're running out of time, so before we run out of time, let's start. Why don't you give out some contact information, how they can reach you, how they can get to the school, how they can contact the school?
Thubten Norbu Ling is located in Santa Fe at 149 East Alameda, and we have a website where people can find out about the classes that we're currently offering, tnlsf.org. If you need to call us, there is a phone message, a machine that you could leave a message and we'll get back to you. 660, that's the 505 area code, 660-7056. The classes that we basically offer, just in a nutshell, are on Sunday mornings. We do what's called Discovering Buddhism, which is appropriate for those who would like to learn a bit more about what the Buddha teaches in a very basic way, as presented in this Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the stages of the path. On Wednesday night, we're studying a text by Lama Tsongkhapa that's an extensive survey of the stages of the path, and that's Wednesday evenings. We do have a couple of practice and meditation sessions throughout the week that people would be welcome at as well, and occasionally we offer a course in Buddhism in a nutshell that is usually done over the course of a weekend or 2 weekends.
Is that what we just did here?
In a sense, this was a really small nutshell. This was like a hazelnut. That's maybe like a walnut or something. Maybe a coconut even, but but we're talking about in that course many of these same teachings and elaborating a little bit further because there's a little bit more time to do that. But if again, you can check our website. We also do introductory meditation courses and occasionally have visiting teachers that round out our course offerings.
Give them the website one more time.
tnlsf.org.
tnlsf.org.
Yes.
Okay, and the phone number.
660-7056.
Wonderful. And before we run out of some time, let me just invite you all to come back next week. Next week we're going to have Reverend Brendan Batchelor from Unity. We're going to talk about what Unity is. She's a very interesting woman, and I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to what she has to say. Also, if you want to any questions, you want to contact me, you want to talk to me about something, at the end of the show there's some rolling credits. Those credits will give my phone number, my email address, my website. If you have anything you want to talk about, anything you heard you want a clarification on, if I can't do it, I'll pass it on to people who can. I'm also a counselor. I do counseling with a spiritual bend to it, because I don't believe that we can solve our problems with the same instrument that creates them. I can't think my way into a better way of living, but I can use my spirit to get me there. So if you may want to give me a call and talk about having a session or 2 or 3 and what that's all about. So that's all be on the outgoing credits. So we got a couple minutes left. You want to give us a parting thought?
Yeah, I guess when it comes to how do we apply any of this in our lives, I think first of all just being clear in ourselves about what it is we're really seeking, and is the way that we're going about seeking it really accomplishing our goals. So many people are invested, as we were talking earlier, about fixing the external world. And Buddha is basically saying we need to fix the internal world.
The external world doesn't matter.
Yeah, and it will take care of itself, because in essence, once again, when we have that view of nirvana, there's nothing different there, we're just seeing it differently. So I think that's the advice I'd give.
Let me maybe stress that it's not a self-guided tour. Somebody has to be there with you.
In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in particular, we say, the dependence on a spiritual guide is very important. But I think we realize that, we learn everything from someone else. With very few things that we sort of discern for ourselves. So, reliance on a teacher, qualified teacher, very important in this path.
And I think almost in any path, but especially this path, but I think you can't get it from a book also.
It's very hard.
A book is not interactive. You can't sit there and ask that person, there's nobody there. Am I doing this right? We delude ourselves. That's part of that attachment.
Yeah. I think the books are excellent for supplementing our education, but the primary education needs to come from someone who teaches us.
Experiential. We have to have a master. It's been, in whatever shape or form that people want to call it, that it's an essential part of it. They can't sit down and take what we've talked about in 58 minutes and I know it all and let's do it.
Exactly. Human experience shows that we need to rely on others for that.
Somebody who's walked the path in front of us, not because we think we know the path, but because the path has been walked in front of us. And they can guide us through it. It's like. Anyway, I just wanted to put that there because I think it's so important that people, our egos get in the way.
Well, and I think this happens in the West to a great extent, because we like that kind of Lone Ranger mentality.
Exactly.
And it can be really problematic because, again, the learning, even if you're relying on a book, still you are relying on another person. But your own understanding needs to be checked against someone else who has already understood it.
Exactly. Don, I thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Reverend Phil. I'll look forward to seeing you again.
Can I put you on the spot? Somewhere down the road, let's do a show on the Tisha 7 points of mindfulness, mind training.
I think that's maybe too much of a spot. I don't know that I could remember them in the time we have left.
Well, not now, but I mean another show.
Oh, at another show. I thought you were putting me on the spot to do them here for you right now.
Commit to another show.
Absolutely, I'd love to do that.
Love to.
That would be terrific.
Okay. Yeah. I want to thank you all for listening. This is Reverend Phil. This is Words of the Prophets. I hope that you get challenged by what you hear, because that's what we're here for, to expand understandings, to give you a little bit more exposure, because there's a whole world out there of spiritual practices, and in a lot of ways they teach the same thing, but a lot of ways they all come up the mountain from different sides. And if you're not happy with the side you're climbing, switch over. And that's what we're here to do, is show you what is available. So until next week, know that you are one with Spirit, you are one with God, you are one with whatever you want to call it. Make use of it and live in love and light. Blessings to you all. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.